Hi, ActiveHistory.ca is happy to present a recording of Ian McKay's talk, War, Memory, and Reaction, Reshaping History in Harper's Canada. It was given to the First Unitarian Congregation in Ottawa at the 2013 Holtom Lecture. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.
It's a tremendous honor to be here, to be part of this lecture series devoted to peace, and to be in this building which has such a remarkable atmosphere, and to be with you tonight. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. And my subject tonight is the conservative use and abuse of history in contemporary Canada, and the way in which war and memory are being bundled together in what I would consider a very compelling reactionary form that I see as reshaping the very texture, the inner meaning, indeed the soul of Canada. I think we are in a very, very dangerous time as a people and as Canadians, and especially as peacemongers. If I could give this a slightly funkier title, I might call it Cleo in Harper Landia. Cleo, you will remember, was the muse of history in ancient Greece. And Harperlandia is the dominion that was once formerly known as Canada. And Cleo in Harperlandia, this muse of history in Harperlandia, has been very, very busy of late. Although her old vocation of searching for the truth has, like Canada, been changed beyond recognition. So I don't know about you, but I find this an extraordinary time to be a Canadian and watch underlying core definitions of our country shifting under our feet. Over the past 3 years, when I first started to talk about this theme and notice it intensively, I've had just repeated shocks, or you could call them epiphanies, of seeing things in Canada that I would never have believed possible in an earlier age. Jan Gomeshi put this really well on the CBC on the 22nd of March this year. He said, and he was talking about the new code of conduct for archivists, in which archivists were actually counseled by their code of conduct not to conduct workshops without the authority of their higher-ups, because these were all high-risk environments in the view of the official code of conduct of the archives. So if you went to a workshop or you talked to a class, this could be construed as a high-risk environment for an archivist. And Jan Gomeshi said about this, freedom abhors a chill. Exactly when and how and why does a chill descend? And when does it get scary? For me, it began to get scary in 2010, when I started reading blaring front page editorials in the Globe and Mail. And these editorials were urging Canadians to pick themselves up after their difficulties in Afghanistan and to begin thinking about where they wanted to fight their next battle. The underlying assumption of the Globe and Mail editorials was not that we could relax and enjoy the fruits of peace. It was that we should be looking aggressively for where we could next exert our military muscle. This is a dangerous world, the Globe kept telling me in 2010. And it would do this with like a Pravda-like stridency on the front page, insistent words that they repeat over and over again, necessary and must. There is no choice but to face up to this new world of infinite danger in which we find ourselves. If you don't believe in a muscular foreign policy, if you believe still clinging to the romantic notion of Pearsonian peacekeeping, there is no place for you in this Canada. I found that scary. It got progressively scarier when my friend Jamie Swift talked me into working with him on our book, Warrior Nation. And as we pored over the countless speeches, treatises, books, press releases, citizenship guides, advertisements from Canada's new right, it suddenly became very plain to us that this is not a normal Canadian government. It's rather a coherent, intensely ideological regime. Some people bristle when you use the term regime and apply it to a Canadian government. Yet this word comes directly from the Calgary School and the philosophers who actually have been thinking intensively about how you can bring Canada to the extreme right. And from the Calgary School perspective, and I'm quoting from Barry Cooper, the kind of philosopher king of this movement, a regime indicates who rules, but especially what type of human being rules, and is sufficiently admired that he or she has the right to enforce or coerce a specific way of life. For the many men and the few women that Jamie and I call the new warriors, those who are actively crafting this new way of thinking about Canada, the coercion that is mentioned by Barry Cooper is indeed necessary. And this is an absolute imperative if you are a loyal Canadian and identify with this program. So that's why words like must and need and necessary resound over and over again in the literature of the New Warriors. These are people who believe in a permanently militarized Canada, doing its best to make the globe safe for unconstrained capitalism. Honor, manliness, and pride are all at stake in their estimation. And so, if necessary, the new values and the new heroes who embody those values must be imposed from above. As Cooper proclaims, the regime's task is clear: to transform Canada from, and I quote, a nation of whiners associated with a thoroughly undignified and suffocatingly maternal political order into a nation of virtuous warriors. As for the sharing, caring Canada of Medicare and unemployment insurance and peacekeeping, all those innovations of the 40s and 50s, as for that Canada, these new warriors resolve to abolish it altogether. Such a state of affairs is absurd, an example of collectivist housekeeping, quoting again from the text. This welfare state has created a welfare state of mind. It must go. We must sow salt upon the ruins of Carthage, exclaims another esteemed master thinker, Thomas Flanagan. And by sowing salt on the ruins of Carthage, in another classic allusion, he means that after you've conquered Carthage and you've captured its fields, you sow salt upon the field so no harvest will ever grow again. In other words, once you've ruined Carthage, you want to make it sure that it never, ever, ever rises again to imperil Rome. By extension, if you've conquered this effete and decadent welfare state, you want to sow the salt that means that this state that you abhor will never rise again. That state that we used to know as Canada. Harper, we all know, is a master of incrementalism. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. His right-wing base, bereft of much red meat on such hot-button issues as gay rights or abortion, can nonetheless be fed hype up laws about law and order, a punitive policy on prisons, the world's most unbalanced policy in the Middle East. All of these things to keep the base enthusiastic as they wait for the next big development. This mixed picture makes it easy for even Harper's opponents to miss the big picture and to underestimate the depth and the breadth and the tenacity of the counter-liberalism for which he stands. It's very useful to go back to Harper's pre-prime ministerial essays, when he really talks about what is driving him as a thinker, as a politician, as someone who wants to change Canada. And in those essays, you will see over and over again the depiction of the left and the liberalism as a dark, menacing, almost satanic force. There can be no compromise with liberalism. There can be no compromise with the left. In his view, the left as a whole represents moral nihilism. It represents the rejection of any tradition or convention of morality. It constitutes a post-Marxism, in his words, with deep resentments, even hatreds, of all the norms of free and democratic Western civilization. And the left, because it champions the welfare state, this caring and sharing Canada, needs to be confronted as our enemy. It is opposed to all our most important institutions, particularly the family. In his eyes, leftists are partisans of a rebellion, and I quote directly, a rebellion against all forms of social norm and moral tradition in every aspect of life. Perhaps it's not too surprising that one doesn't sit down with these opponents, these apostles of moral nihilism, to have a cup of coffee or exchange insights about how things might proceed, or say, maybe you've got a point of view that I might consider. There is an absolutism to these judgments that I doubt very much has ever actually wavered. So for all the strategic hemmings and hawings and all of the tactics of playing this and playing that, do not lose sight of the big picture. That this is someone who seriously wants to change the soul of Canada and to revoke its dalliance with what he feels was moral nihilism. There's no hint of dialogue, sharing of insights, the reasonable exchange of views in this vision. You are either with us, the shapers of this new warrior Canada, or you are against us, a purveyor of or a prisoner of the dark chaos of moral nihilism. Well, what is Cleo to do in this new dispensation? Poor muse of history. Well, I would recommend that Cleo mind her P's and Q's. The core thing that Cleo must do is not utter discouraging words. In fact, of course, as we show in our book, Cleo has been fully conscripted. Look at the $34.7 million extravaganza celebrating the War of 1812, in which young children were taught how much good, clean fun you could have reenacting a 19th century war. It took real chutzpah to remake one of the world's most inconclusive conflicts into an uplifting birth of the nation moment. But somehow they helped us do it. So you could drink War of 1812 wine on Via Rail. You could go to War of 1812 battle reenactments. Regrettably missing the battlefield amputations of wounded soldiers and severed limbs and mourning widows and orphan children and burned farmhouses and the whole panoply of things that actually went down in the War of 1812. You could actually go up, dress up as a soldier and have some good, clean fun carrying your musket. There was even War of 1812 ice cream. I didn't believe it, but one of my students gave it to me. You've got to be joking. With blood, they actually had little blood that you could sort of was a cherry flavored. It was, a little bit over the top. What you required to do this War of 1812 extravaganza was essentially purge yourself of any critical faculties. You had to disregard almost everything about the War of 1812, so it was factual, complicated, subject to interpretation, matter of pain or difficulty. You had to largely forget that the First Nations were catastrophically victimized in the War of 1812 and lost the prospect of a homeland in the interior of North America. You had to forget a great deal. You had to forget that inhabitants on both sides of the border were split on the War of 1812. That many people in the British North American colonies didn't want to go to war, thought this was a waste of time, or actually sympathized with the Americans. Vice versa, a lot of American states in New England actually came up to Halifax to sue for a separate peace. That would be to make the War of 1812 a teaching moment, not a propaganda moment. But in Harperlandia, Cleo is not expected to come up with facts or opinions or new interpretations. Cleo is expected to give you a good time. No previous federal government since the First World War has propounded such a blood and soil doctrine of the Canadian nation, where we're incessantly going back to some pivotal battle or some great war and seeing that as the birth of our country. And conversely, no recent federal government has ever been as volubly dismissive of peace as a Canadian ideal. Traditionally, our participation in world bodies, first the League of Nations, and then the United Nations, and even NATO, which Canadians tried to imagine was a peacekeeping operation, our participation in all of these international bodies was presented as one of the best results of our achievement of independence. So if you go back to how the Great War of 1914-18 was remembered by the people in the 1920s and the early 30s, when they reflected on the war, which they thought had been a terrible tragedy, had wiped out so many young Canadians, and had a kind of whiff of terrible futility about it, as the conflicts again re-erupted in Europe and nothing seemed to have been settled. At least Canadians told themselves one thing, and that was at least we had found our way onto the League of Nations. where we could be a peacekeeper. The whole point of the Great War, as they told that story, was that it had led to Canada as a peacekeeping country. Of course, there was an element of illusion and nationalism and myth-making in their conviction, but it was their conviction, and that's how they saw the Great War. Not a blood and soil nationalism, not an irrationalism, not a great respect for the militarism and the adventure of war, but a sober realization that this war had been a catastrophic moment in Western civilization. At least one could find a glimmer of hope in Canada's extraction from it and its participation in peacekeeping bodies. For them, Canada was peace, not war. Almost 9 in 10 Canadians today tell pollsters that promoting world peace is, quote, the most important policy objective for Canada. I was amused to see astronaut Chris Hadfield, seriously out of step, I would submit, with the right-wing zeitgeist, listing Canada's peacekeepers, nowadays a truly endangered and dwindling species, as some of his favorite Canadian heroes. Some of the new warriors, when they encounter viewpoints like Chris Hadfield's, or those of many other Canadians, actually talk among themselves about the need to repair the psyches of Canadians. This is happening in their workshops and first of all, I find it sort of startling as a Canadian to think that a body of people feels entitled to repair our psyches. But secondly, I'm sort of really taken by the enthusiasm which they know that the Canadian fascination with peacekeeping and peace is a monstrous moral error that could only emanate from a confused or diseased psyche. This is Harperlandia. So the old peaceable kingdom theme has not died out entirely among the Canadian people, but the regime is working very hard to undermine it. Look at all of what it's done recently to change our international profile. The abolition of CEDA, a once proud agency that was even entitled at one point to its own cabinet minister in the cabinet, now folded up and gone. Nowadays, with jaw-dropping candor, and these are some of the moments of my epiphany where I'm reading the Globe and Mail saying, come on, this has got to be like an Onion magazine satire on Canada in 2013. When you read these missives from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and they'll be saying things like, obviously, Canadian development policy should be one of assisting our mining corporations around the world and doing whatever we can to help corporations to develop the global south. It would be hard to imagine a more polar opposite to the Canada that many Canadians thought they were building in the 40s and 50s. And the same week that one learned that the Pearson Centre for Peacekeeping is in trouble because of the shortage of federal finances, we also learned that the Harper government will refuse to sign a treaty regulating the global arms trade on the tenuous argument that this treaty might be linked to the now abolished long gun registry. We've never quite encountered a phenomenon like Harperism on our soil, and I think many Canadians falter before they can take its true measure. I notice in the mass media how keen we are to sort of go after all the little questions and avoid all the big questions. Canadians, I think, as a people, are uncomfortable with the idea of ideology and the fact that we might even have one. And to have an ideological change like this sort of goes against our grain. I think Canadians, by and large, are pragmatic, practical people. And this is not practical, pragmatic politics. This is ideologically driven politics that's really about abstract, symbolic, but important issues about what we mean as a people. So I notice in the media how obsessed we get with the little questions of Senate perks and aircraft procurements or Harper's quirks of personality, and miss how pervasively influential the notion of perpetual war has become in Canada. We're missing the big picture. We are undergoing step by step a vast sea change in this country of ours. But whenever we try to talk about it, somehow we always end up talking about Mike Duffy's episodes in Prince Edward Island or Pamela Wallen's sojourns in Saskatchewan. The magnitude of regime change in Canada, the very regime change that the Calgary School has been consistently demanding for 3 decades, the magnitude of that change escapes us. It's as though we cannot face it. We do not like thinking this way. Let's try to think this way. Because thinking about this as a big regime change, as a major cultural struggle, will actually help us connect the dots and see what the major forces are that are making this happen. There's a wonderful book by Corey Robin called The Reactionary Mind, which he brought out in 2011. And I think Corey Robin really helps us see, well, what is it about these conservatives that gives them this particular cultural mission in life? What is it about conservatism that means they can't just sort of relax and say, well, we won and we can go to the center and sort of, reap the rewards of power for a couple of years. And, this brand of conservatism, Corey Robin says in The Reactionary Mind, is a meditation on a theoretical rendition of the felt experience of having had power, seeing that power threatened, and then trying to win it back again. All conservatism of this sort begins with past or impending loss. So this kind of conservative rightly perceives in any programs of economic redistribution and social justice an extension of freedom from the few to the many. All of the great movements of emancipation from the French Revolution onwards have posited a nexus between freedom and equality. But it is this precisely which conservatism must deny. So conservatism, he writes, is the theoretical voice of this animus against the agency of the subordinate class. It provides the most consistent and profound arguments as to why the lower orders must not be allowed to exercise their independent will, why they should be not allowed to govern themselves or the polity. Submission is their first duty, agency the prerogative of the state. So what defines conservatism is a fear, an acute fear in the hearts of those who have traditionally wielded power in the face of real or imagined challenges from those who might take it away from them. I find this incredibly insightful when trying to unravel the emotional as well as intellectual texture of Harperism. Notice, for instance, the puzzling note of panic and victimhood, even after the Harperites have been in power for almost 8 years. They're always panic-stricken. It is always 5 minutes to midnight. There's always a crime wave that is sweeping the country. I think within them there lurks this fear of an almost bottomless abyss of liberal moral nihilism, a seething mass of disorder and confusion and loss which threatens everything Harper and his acolytes stand for. And this is all epitomized for them by the social democratic welfare state, by peacekeeping, and also by genuinely critical inquiry. On issue after issue, the tone is not one of a victorious, optimistic, relaxed embrace of the future seen as a perhaps better place, but a grim, almost paranoid sense of being under siege, of holding moral nihilism at bay. One can never relax one's vigilance. The liberal and or socialist enemy is everywhere, plotting against ethical oil, or ethical wars, or ethical family life. So on this enemy terrain, you advance cautiously, incrementally, surrounded on all sides by potential saboteurs and plotters. In this paranoid worldview, oddly reminiscent, said John Iveson the other day, of Joseph Stalin in one of his bad days, there are few, if any, legitimate critics on the other side. Consequently, the public sphere itself progressively shrinks. The zone of legitimate opinion starts to shrink, and as do the institutions in which public opinion might be better informed and better able to critique the existing order. Universities become business schools. Libraries and archives are slashed to their minimum. Public television is starved to become a forlorn shadow of its former self. And because this form of conservatism is now tightly intermeshed with corporate capital, it is noteworthy that the social forms it imposes on institution after institution are those of the corporate world. All of their strategies are corporate-based, and all of them entail control from the top down. There is a moral imperative, and not just an economic rationale, entailed in the conservatives' demand that, quote, best practices be followed in a host of fields, and that these best practices should follow those observed in large businesses. And also that Canada's CEO, formerly known as its Prime Minister, should have the freedom to terminate underlings and even prorogue inconvenient parliaments if they impede the business-like functioning of the regime. So much of Harperism is haunted horribly by the decades of darkness in which conservatives, in their own minds at least, lost command of the state, on some readings in 1968, on others in 1945. But a closely to be watched tradition of this form of thinking is a kind of declension thesis about history. There was a good Canada, and then there was a bad Canada. And now we're struggling to get the good Canada back again. It depends on which one of these thinkers you're reading. For some, the more radical ones, I think, the good Canada sort of stops in the 1920s, when you started to see the very first intimations of the welfare state. More moderates would say, well, maybe it's the 1940s when Mackenzie King starts to bring in unemployment insurance and modifies the Constitution and starts to centralize power in Ottawa. Perhaps the greater majority, like Jason Kenney would say, is the era of bell-bottom jeans in the 1960s, with 1968 as a terrible moment of transition. But whatever the strategy and the implementation and interpretation is, there is always this declension thesis of a good Canada drifting into a bad Canada. So this is the decade of darkness theme that is very, very prominent among conservative thought today. Indeed, if you look at the most recent throne speech, Google it and get it up online tonight after you go home, you will notice the decade of darkness theme is there, even in the throne speech. They cannot let this go, right? And the decade of darkness in this case refers to the supposed decade of darkness of the 1990s, when the Canadian military was pared to the bone and didn't have its budgets observed. Some of us might think, well, the 1990s, right after the Cold War, there seemed to be like a moment maybe where we could sort of breathe again and not have imminent world devastation breathing down our necks. But from this point of view, this is a moment of weakening, moral looseness, and with the absence of an enemy, we sort of needed to find another one. This decade of darkness theme is all over their work. When I first started talking about Harperism in history 3 years ago, I noticed lots of subtle indications that people in the audience would be saying, oh, well, whatever, they're the left is going on again. They're always finding these dark conspiracies and, they're on about fluoridation, and now they're on about this, and they're on about something else. Not that anybody would ever be kind of mean enough to tell me this, but you sort of get this feeling that, oh, well, I see that you're all worked up about this, but there's not a whole lot to be really worked up about. It's just a kind of change, and this is a right-wing government. We don't expect you guys to like it, but, get over it, move on. A normal Canadian situation. And oddly enough, I really want to believe those people. I was in a debate the other day in Kingston with a guy who just brought out a new book about Trudeau called The Truth About Trudeau. And spoiler alert, Trudeau was a crypto-communist, an avid peacenik, and the scourge of big business in Canada. So therefore, not a good guy in the eyes of this author. But his overall point, this guy named Robert Plamondon, his overall point was this is a very normal government, doing normal conservative things, and don't worry too much. There's a kind of direct line of continuity between John A. Macdonald and Stephen Harper. I desperately want to believe this. I dearly, dearly hope that our analysis in Warrior Nation, 15 years from now, people will say, they all pressed the panic button. Actually, there was nothing to worry about. It was just like a blip. And if we are proved wrong, and please try and prove me wrong, I will be so, so grateful to you. Unfortunately, I think where Warrior Nation, the book, goes astray is that it is not drastic enough. I think Warrior Nation actually anticipated a much slower evolution of these themes. I think we didn't quite anticipate how fast, how radically, and how drastically the Canadian order was going to shift. I think we underestimated our valid case. I find myself on almost a daily basis having these moments of incredulity, because the processes we tracked in Warrior Nation are like the melting of the Arctic, proceeding at a far faster pace than Jamie and I anticipated. So as I have talked to audiences across Canada over the past 3 years, I have started to sense that the message that this is not a normal government is not meeting with incredulity anymore. People are starting to sense that this is a government with a very different agenda, a kind of blood and soil agenda, a totalizing agenda. And this is starting to become more and more apparent in their treatment of history. A chill indeed has descended, as Jan Gomeshi said. There is a pervasive realization that something is not normal about this government. This is a regime in Cooper's sense, one that is consciously undertaken to rebrand the country. Of course, the risk to critics of this process is that we will start applying analogies drawn from past experiences of authoritarianism. And what we'll miss is what is distinctive about this particular brand of authoritarianism. We will miss how intelligently its extreme makeover of Canada is drawing upon and refashioning age-old myths and symbols. In other words, we'll be apt to discount the intelligence, the careful craft that has gone into shaping what I would call a new form of integral nationalism. We will miss how carefully and intelligently they have pitched their appeal to working-class Canadians. And I suggest that unless and until the phenomenon of Harperism is theorized as this ideological complex, we are not going to have much luck in countering it. It is actually a much more deep-seated process even than the election and hopefully the defeat of a particular government. So let me just talk very briefly about how I would theorize what's happening to us in terms of this idea of integral nationalism. The problem I see for a neoliberal government like this is that there's something quite deflating about neoliberalism as a way of life, as a belief system. That is, the neoliberal schema is to apply market criteria to as many aspects of life as is feasible. You want to marketize pretty well everything. For a state that undertakes this, what it does is basically means that if you're coming up with this Canada Inc. strategy, it's hard to see why people should buy in too heavily to make sacrifices for Canada Inc. If you've made Canada into a corporation, should people really be all that enthusiastic about it? Would you die for Coca-Cola? Then would you die for Canada Inc.? What's the difference? It becomes more and more tenuous to secure the legitimacy of a government in a neoliberal era. We all sort of realize that they're basically all singing from the same hymn book, and the hymn is going to be very much the same wherever you go. It's very hard, in short, to feel loyal to a government that has redefined itself and the country as a business. And yet, they need this loyalty. This is not like an optional extra. Neoliberalism is not just the demolishing of tariff barriers and the institution of competition throughout the globe. It requires very strong states to make this work. You need neoliberal states that will enlist their populations in this radical program. So one way, and I think this is the key to what we're seeing all around us, the paradox, one way of soliciting this agreement of the population to a regime that actually isn't going to do very much for them in terms of raising their living standards is through an intensification of older, traditional languages of identity and nation. Look at the United States, where a very, very modern, technologically savvy country is nonetheless always being told about its quasi-religious mission to spread enlightenment through the world, its exceptional role in the whole history of humanity. It's kind of a millennial nationalism in the United States married to transnational capital. And yet I would put it to you that there's immense popular support in the United States for this extremely expansive program of national assertion. Even though this offers minimal tangible benefits for the bulk of the working population, it doesn't offer them many tangible benefits, but it offers some bevy of intangible goods, such as a sense of security in an anxious world, the transcendence of the monotony and boredom of modern life, and a quasi-religious sense of belonging and being part of a great crusade for human freedom. You can call this integral nationalism. And by integral nationalism, it means that the nationalist believes that all of society is one great organism that must be integrated by the state. And not just any state, but a state with a powerful and strong leader. So classically, integral nationalism talks about all the parts of society coming together and being harmonized in a kind of cooperative effort. And it needs to project that then into a world that it perceives as a kind of one of perpetual conflict and difficulty. If you're an integral nationalist, you look to the leader and you say, you owe that leader your deepest loyalty, because that leader is the exemplar and the embodiment of your integral national state. Canada has copied integral nationalism almost hook, line, and sinker from the United States. Many of the same techniques of militarization, even the same rituals and symbols are played out in Canada as they are in the United States, with one fascinating and important exception. And here, the exception is that the essence of Canada in the new nationalism is located outside the country. In the new nationalism, rather than celebrating things that happened in Canada, we're apt to celebrate all the things that contributed to the Anglosphere, the great alliance of the United States and Great Britain that in the new nationalism is the fount of human civilization. So the things that we celebrate about Canada are the things that feed into the Anglosphere, this great unity of the old empires. So you see what's peculiar about this nationalism is that rather than hailing things made in Canada achievements, it hails things that are actually drawn from outside Canada to a large extent, or the wars that Canada fights beyond its borders, or the figures from beyond its borders that come in and tell Canadians what they're really about. Canada has this odd problem of never having actually achieved its own sovereignty. It's always shared sovereignty with another imperial power, first with Great Britain and now with the United States. When Canadians attempted historically to be nationalistic, they have often then very logically looked at ways in which you can add Canadian peacekeeping to the world. And in many ways, Canadian peacekeeping in the Pearson era was a form of Canadian nationalism, saying we are better and we're more peaceable and we're more civilized. We're not going to actually rock the boat of the Americans too much, but we're going to sort of have this added plus. But notice the difference with the new nationalism of today, which has actually explicitly renounced this peacekeeping vocation. For now, the new integral nationalism says that you must focus not on things that are peculiar to Canada, but on the Anglosphere, on the unity of the United States and Great Britain as they fight their enemies throughout the entire world. So I think much of the motivation behind Harperism is undoubtedly economic. But I think, as well, you cannot reduce it to economics. Because I think a nation-building enterprise such as this, a new nation-building enterprise such as this, requires the development of transcendent, moving, death-defying narratives, ones that link each individual to the vast historical dramas of the people. In this case, the English-speaking peoples. As in the American case, integral nationalism in Canada is transmitted through the most modern of media, drawing on the latest techniques of mass persuasion and the latest approaches to branding. So one of the great messages of the new nationalism is that we must get out in that global marketplace and take it on. But at the same time, and here is a core argument that I'm going to make tonight, this nationalism is uncannily traditional. In many respects, it essentially recapitulates many older British imperial myths and symbols, most notably the British monarchy, Whiggish conceptions of the almost perfect British Constitution, and so on. We are being taught to revere British battles, or heroes from Canadian history that long antedate Confederation. So in the new Citizenship Guide, which I brought along and happy to give out if anyone wants to look at it, in the new Citizenship Guide we're being counseled to revere Canadian heroes from the Indian Mutiny of 1857. When Canadian soldiers went and settled the hash of the Indians in the Sepoy Mutiny who had the temerity to demand Indian independence. We're celebrating the Crimean War. We're celebrating the South African War. All as moments of our great national history of war-making. So Canadians' core political meaning in this new dispensation is not that Canada is a modern democracy with a developed welfare state, but rather that it is a constitutional monarchy upholding concepts of ordered freedom throughout the world. One of the most fascinating, alarming elements of the new nationalism is its reliance upon race theory. In the new Citizenship Guide, John Buchan, Lord Tweedsmuir, Governor General from 1935 to 1940, is saluted as the apostle of Canadian multiculturalism. Our present-day Governor General singles out Lord Tweedsmuir as his great model. When he wakes up in Veto Hall and wonders, what am I going to do as a Governor General? He reaches for the model of Lord Tweedsmuir. Lord Tweedsmuir, race theorist, South Africa, architect of concentration camps in South Africa, the man who in 1937 warned the students of McGill against Negroid music. I cannot repeat all the things that Lord Tweedsmuir said about people of color from a podium in a church. Somehow, we're revering Lord Tweedsmuir, and he's the only 20th century Canadian political figure who's given his own direct quotation in the Citizenship Guide read by every new Canadian. We're revering Lord Tweedsmuir because he sanctifies our presence in the Anglosphere. And we're looking past, or perhaps we're even celebrating, his deep, deep racism. But then one should draw your attention as well to the speeches of Prime Minister Harper, when he as well salutes the British race, whose voyage from one great triumph to another has been the joy and the blessing of the world. And I'm not saying that Stephen Harper is talking about the British race. Stephen Harper uses the phrase, the British race, as the core and the fountain of our identity. So if we're trying to unpack this new integral nationalism, you see, we need to be smart. We need to say, okay, what is really working here? How could this really be effective with people? Developing these 5 commanding theses about Canada. First of all, as I've mentioned, Canada is, always will be, and must be a British land. So look at the omnipresent return to images of the Queen, the return of royal to institutions that have been deroyalized in the 1960s. Even a suggestive fondness for that old biblical term, dominion. As one prominent exponent of this outlook explains, Canada is not a departure from the British Empire. Canada is a successor state to the British Empire, inheriting all of its glories and all of its power. And his outlook has become the predominant one in the new Citizenship Guide. For this regime, it is a moral and political error to imply that Canada is or should ever be a post-colonial state. To think that Canada was shaped, for example, by Aboriginal peoples with a strong moral and political claim to recognition as nations is to indulge, and I quote from this authority, in noble, savage romanticism. Our Constitution is British. We are a British people. Our Constitution was not co-made by French Canadians, and it was not co-made by Aboriginals. To imagine Canada as a compact between French and English speakers is to mistake an enclave of francophones for a people. Canadians in this reading just are essentially eternally British. And this has been explicitly endorsed by Stephen Harper. You might think that these references to race are a bit jarring. Race has had a kind of uneven record in the 20th century. Race theory had acquired a kind of problematic reputation after 1945. Many people think there are very good political and scientific reasons to regard claims made about the virtues of any particular race with a certain amount of suspicion. And yet this emphasis on race is profoundly consistent with an integral nationalism that emphasizes not so much Canada as the Anglosphere, that great Anglo-American alliance. And this is the core of the new imagined community. The supposed multiculturalism of the regime then is a kind of chimera. There is no contradiction, and never was in the Victorian period, in celebrating the colorful clothes, scintillating spices, and festive folkways of the empire's many subject races. All the while doing everything you can to remind these races that their primary loyalty must be to the unity of the empire and its monarch. And a second theme core to this nationalism are doctrines of faith and virtue. As historian Jack Granenstein insists, and I quote, Canada has a dominant cultural pattern comprising Judeo-Christian ethics, the progressive spirit of the Enlightenment, and the institutions and values of British political culture. Canadians must realize that they are engaged, and I quote, in a war for the soul and survival of their country against all, and one imagines there are many moral nihilists in their company who oppose these ideals. So adherents of other monotheistic or polytheistic or non-theistic or indeed atheistic belief systems must realize that they are located not at the core of this nation's myth-symbol complex, but rather at its margins. It has been striking to see the return of religion as a political discourse in Canada. And indeed, for many Canadians, the dramatic appeal of this new integral nationalism is a religious one. Some of them seek to reclaim Canada for Christ and to redeem a country that has been, in the words of one highly influential Christian warrior, defiled to the core by an anti-God agenda for decades. Again, note, and this is a religious version of that same declension thesis I was mentioning before. There was a good Canada, and then the bad people came in and defiled it. For this regime, an integral aspect of its new nationalism is Israel. Israel emerges as almost a vital, intensively covered part of the Canadian imagined community, and it is as much core to this project as any part of Canada itself. Support of the Israeli state is a sine qua non of this form of loyal Canadianism. Remember Tom Flanagan's phrase, we must sow salt upon the ruins of Carthage. And in this case, we must bury for good the partial, faltering steps Mike Pearson once took in the Middle East, where he thought peacekeeping might make a difference. And instead, we must take up a foreign policy based on legitimizing conquest, discrimination, and endless violence. A third big theme in this new nationalism is an emphasis on the leader. One of the most amazing things about the Citizenship Guide, you really have to see this, is the doctrine of the dual personification in the inner front covers. And you might say, well, what on earth is the doctrine of the dual personification? Well, this is something that as loyal Canadians, especially if you're an immigrant trying to become a loyal Canadian, you are expected to learn. This is actually setting off the entire document. According to the now official doctrine of the dual personification, as promulgated to every new Canadian, Canada is personified by the sovereign, just as the sovereign is personified by Canada. That clear to you all, class? And then you sort of wonder why are like 30 to 40% of people flunking the citizenship test? Well, I think I would be hard-pressed without a course in medieval metaphysics to really unpack all the subtleties in that saying. But for all the air of sort of ancien regime metaphysics in that pronouncement, notice what it's doing is making the sovereign absolutely pivotal to your Canadianism and saying that all of Canadians have achieve an organic unity in our sovereign. So vested in the leader of this corporate entity, you have one big figure who carries the destiny of the entire nation. And of course, the sovereign is also represented within Canada by the Governor-General and de facto by the Prime Minister. When the monarch acts, he or she, as our organic and collective personification, acts not only for us, but in a way is us. So this new monarchism excludes from full participation in the nation anyone who does not acknowledge as an essence within yourself the full presence of the sovereign. Canadian history on this reading only begins when the British arrive and exert hegemony over the Empire's other subjects. So notice what's happened to Cleo in Harperlandia. Cleo once haunted the archives. She spent her busy days peering into microfilm readers in the arduous pursuit of facts and truth. Nowadays, Cleo has a much more glamorous role. Cleo wears a crown. A fourth theme to emphasize is the emphasis on a much tougher, leaner, more competitive country. And the peaceable kingdom has transformed into a term of derision not to be used among people of breeding and decorum. It is a jungle out there, we are told insistently. It is no place for people who have been softened and coddled by the nanny state. It is no place for intellectuals with their statistics and their theories and their facts and their models about global climate change. It is no land for peacekeepers. The real Canadians can be found on the CBC in Dragon's Den, and poo-pooing concussions on Coach's Corner, and anticipating the next adventure of our military forces. And this, of course, leads us to the fifth and final point about the new integral nationalism, which our book Warrior Nation develops at length. The new Canada is all about war all the time. Even when we're not officially fighting a war or where the country is in essence at peace, which it has been, notwithstanding the Kandahar War, the country has essentially been at peace since Korea. No, you should not think that way. You should not think about peace, you should think about war. You should think about Canadian soldiers, irrespective of what they did or the war in question, as our archetypal Canadian heroes. Remembrance Day ceremonies have transformed themselves in my lifetime from ceremonies in which one mourned the sad loss of our boys and girls in armed conflicts and mourned the deaths of these young people and prayed for peace and mused about the horrors of war and how great it would be to avoid another one. Remembrance Day has slowly morphed into claims that war is core to our identity, that all of our freedoms stemmed from war, that without our soldiers we would have no freedoms. We see the efflorescence of militarist symbols, highways of heroes, proposed legislation making it a special crime to desecrate war memorials, publicity campaigns that have bedecked your own streets in Ottawa with banners proclaiming the Great War as the birth of the nation. Yet another birth of the nation. We keep going through these rebirthing moments. Right? You go from one war to the next and you're trying to find this war that got Canada started. And all these ways we are being told that war is our core identity, that the nation's freedom was secured by its soldiers, whether they were fighting for Canada in India in the 1850s, in South Africa in 1902, on Vimy Ridge in 1917, or more recently in Afghanistan and Libya. You sacralize war and then you demonize anybody who raises questions about war. We all remember the Taliban Jack campaign, in which Jack Layton and his loyalty to his country was aggressively stigmatized by people who did not feel that anyone who criticized Canada's effort in Afghanistan could be a loyal Canadian. This is a sharp contrast to previous Canadas. When J.S. Whitworth opposed the coming of the Second World War and stood up in the House of Commons and said, "I cannot agree with the Second World War," was he shouted down by the opposition benches? Did people spit upon him, or did they impugn his character? Did they say he was anti-Christian, an opponent of Canada? They listened in silence. And many of them said afterwards, "We deeply respect the extremely difficult decision you have come to. Agonizing over that decision, we have come to a different position." Personally, I think Wordsworth's opponents came to the right decision. But as a Canadian of that school, I deeply respect them for agonizing over it, for trying to find every alternative to war, to saying war is not the first thing that comes to our mind. It should be way down the list of things that come to our mind when we're thinking about how to construct Canada. I think the Canada that I am proud of was the one that listened with quiet respect to J.S. Wordsworth as he explained his opposition to the Second World War in the House of Commons. And the Canada I find very difficult to live with, that alarms me deeply, that offends my soul, to tell you the truth, is a Canada where someone like Wordsworth, someone like Jack Layton, anyone who has a different opinion about war and peace is shouted down, stigmatized, confined to the margins. Not my Canada. But it is the Canada that is evolving all around us, with these 5 big elements, constructing a new, integral, conservative nationalism that is becoming part of our daily life. And make no mistake, this is a potent brew. It does not just appeal to silly people or ignorant people. It actually has a very deep resonance. It appeals deeply to people. We all want our lives to mean something. We all want to connect ourselves to big forces and transcendent forces outside ourselves. And the nation gives many people that sense of belonging, that sense of higher purpose. What better way of creating this kind of nation than appealing to age-old myths and symbols, to the magic and the romance of the British monarchy, to the great exploits of an immemorial race, bringing civilization and order to an unruly word, loyalty to a God-given duty to transform the benighted peoples of the planet. But still notice what is peculiar and I think vulnerable about this nationalism. Its definition of the Canadian essence, that Canada's meaning and destiny lies in its relationship with the great English-speaking peoples, the British and the Americans. This surprisingly locates that essence outside the borders of Canada itself. So in a way, Canada becomes almost a peripheral entity in this new imagined community, the Anglosphere, in which loyal Canadians must vest their deepest loyalty. So this, in bare summary is the new nationalism of the regime. And it is a beguiling mix of martial metaphors, sterling notions of God and race and empire. But let me wrap up just by briefly indicating the ways in which the articulation of this complex of myths and symbols requires the dismantling and even dismemberment of other approaches to history. So you see, this is a two-sided struggle. Not only is there a new attempt to create this new organic nationalism, it's also an attempt to wipe out the tools of scholarship, the means of critical communication, the ability to counter this narrative with facts and theories and knowledge based on actual knowledge. Cleo in Harperlandia has to get by without a critical consciousness, without a sharp sense of the complexities and pain of history. Indeed, Cleo must get by without the research capacity upon which historical intelligence critically depends. Look at the remaking of the Canadian Museum of Civilization. The new mandate of the Canadian Museum of History is going to be that this will abolish the old mandate of the old museum, which committed us to the critical understanding, and I'm quoting from the old mandate, the critical understanding of the cultural achievements and human behavior of people around the planet. You replace that notion of critical understanding with the notion of appreciation, the appreciation of Canadian history. So they have already demolished the parts of the old Museum of Civilization that convey the kind of old understanding. They're letting go a lot of the researchers at the old Museum of Civilization. And what you're doing is basically sidelining the whole idea, the explicit idea of encouraging critical understanding and moving to appreciation. So it's not just to be about a Canadian museum, it's supposed to be a nation-building museum. And how much more fun this Cleo is than the old Cleo. Because this Cleo isn't going to take you on any guilt trips, no more self-loathing, no more cosmopolitan ambitions of understanding other cultures with critical appreciation. Just a celebration of Canada, a proud nation doing great things. So when James Moore unveiled this project in the House of Commons, he pointed scornfully to his critics on the opposite side, and he said, unlike them, we will express our pride in Canada's heritage. Or take the even more candid comment of Jim Hillier, MP from Lethbridge. And Hillier said, the days of government-sponsored self-loathing are gone. We are getting sick and tired of being told by some academic or government official that being Canadian is something that must be apologized for. The opening press release in the campaign was headlined, Harper Government to Unveil New Celebration of Canadian History. So one of your local journalists, Paul Sullivan, wrote very discerningly, I thought, bye-bye Canadian Museum of Civilization, hello grade 8 history. Instead of all that civilization malarkey, we'll gather all our national cliches in one convenient location. The last spike, or Maurice Richard's hockey sweater. And Dan Gardner in the Ottawa Citizen was equally pointed. Boys' own adventure stories and tales of daring do are not history. Airbrushed portraits of great men, lists of national triumphs, schemes to inculcate national identity or pride. None of that is history. Not serious history anyway. When I read that, I mused to myself, clearly there was another psyche calling out for repair by the folks from the Department of National Defense. In her new phase, this lobotomized Cleo smiles beguilingly. She's not going to make us feel conflicted or guilty, and has, thank goodness, lost her boring old obsession with facts and accuracy. And you can run down the number of institutions in your city that are being, in effect, destroyed through this program. Library and Archives Canada, 29th of March, 2012. Black day in the Canadian historical community when they fired huge numbers of archivists, closing down whole programs. Archives is a national treasure, built up over generations, and never before has it been a political plaything like this. And this will have an impact for years, privatizing parts of the National Archives collection so that millions of documents will be inaccessible for 10 years. As I said starting out in this talk, I would love to learn that 10 years from now, you and I can get together and say, we were so worried. We were scared. All over now. I'd love to be proved misguided, and I hope you can show me the error of my ways. I hope after Harper turns into history, Harperlandia will also vanish into the past. I hope it will come to be regarded as a minor blip in the road. But my historical training tells me to distrust any such hope. Unfortunately, I see a very strong correlation between the attack on the possibility of critical historical knowledge and the myth-making we see, the history as propaganda we see all over this new Canada. I see an audacious new integral nationalism that has real strength and appeal, one that can muster powerful myths and symbols of race, particularly, of noble warriors, of age-old glories. And these myths and symbols have proved extremely tenacious and toxic in other countries. Integral nationalism of this type tends to authoritative and final answers to difficult questions. As it unfolds in Canada, we may anticipate many future moments when it collides with the obdurate and enduring paradoxes of Canadian identity. We will also surely find that the all-British celebration of the Queen and the Empire leaves some Canadians cold. Will Cleo remain a conscript in this campaign to transform the myths and symbols of Canada? The struggle for the divided soul of a complicated people? Or will Canadians, with their psyches as yet unadjusted by the boys at National Defence, become affronted by this country's descent into irrationalism, by the rhetorical violence preceded by real violence, by the countless instances of repression and cruelty and crudity in this new Canada? Will Canadians rise up and resist with all their hearts the brave new world of Harperlandia?
You've been listening to a recording of Ian McKay's talk, War, Memory, and Reaction, Reshaping History in Harper's Canada. It was given to the First Unitarian Congregation in Ottawa as the 2013 Holtom Lecture. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.